Now we move our discussion towards French and Dutch colonization. So we're moving away from early Spanish colonization, but it was important to spend some time on that because they're really spearheading the effort, as I mentioned. Okay, but later on, the French and Dutch are going to make their colonizing efforts into the New World. And it's important to realize this geographically, they're obviously not going to be involved in what we call Spanish America, right, in the New World, which was found, let's say, in parts of Georgia, what we call Georgia today, the state of Georgia, certainly Florida, and then moving southward into Central America and South America. All right. So that's already occupied by Spain. So when the French come over and the Dutch, they're going to be focusing more north of that, geographically speaking. Okay. What we call, you know, today, United States of America, as well as Canada. Okay. So when it came to the French, relatively speaking, they're less involved in spreading Christianity or attaining glory for the French Empire. That's not to say that there's no efforts to convert the natives. In fact, there was a significant presence of French Jesuits, okay, in North America during the 1500s, 1600s. But the French are less preoccupied with this. Rather, they have their eyes focused on attaining wealth, to establish trade, and to establish their presence in the New World as a commercial one rather than a military one. Okay, so it's important to note that it's a very important distinction that Spain, when they initially came over, it's in the form of a military conquest, right? You see Spanish soldiers that we talked about, the conquistadors. They're establishing military outposts and military force there. But when it came to the later French, you see more of the presence of trading posts, right? Trading settlements. Okay, and interestingly enough, and again, in distinction to the earlier Spanish, they tended to be more humane and liberal in their outlook towards the native and indigenous people in the New World. Okay, now I use the term liberal here, more humane and liberal in the treatment of Indians. Of course, I don't mean liberal as in today's political context, right? It basically means open-minded or tolerant, right? This word liberal. So they tended to be more tolerant. They debated much less about whether Indians possess souls or stuff like that. In fact, they tended to see them as more or less equal to Europeans, okay, or just people in the old world in general. Okay, so it's an interesting way, right, that they contrasted with Spain and certainly later English, okay, for the most part again. Okay, so because of their general tolerance and their recognition of Indians as being equal, as having reason and rationality, right? It led to this interesting case, which Richard White, a historian, he wrote a book in the 1990s, I believe, called Middle Ground. Okay, so Richard White is a present day historian. Actually, he's still teaching, I believe, in one of the Ivy League universities. And Richard White's book, The Middle Ground, as it was titled, basically uncovers the existence of this society or community that was marked by the melding of both the French traders in this area. And by the way, where was this area? Well, it was in the Great Lakes region of the United States. Okay, so what we call the Upper Midwest, right? The French were there to establish trade relations, and they interacted with the indigenous tribes there, and they were called the Algonquins. Algonquins. I believe it's spelled Algonquin. Algonquin tribe. Okay, so what happened is not conflict. Okay, of course, the initial meeting may have been marked by tension, right? and uncertainty. And this is probably facilitated because both the Algonquin and the French um, tended to treat each other as equals, right? We could assume that, and I'm sure Richard White discusses in this book. So what we have, in other words, is not conquest in the case of the middle ground here in the Great Lakes region. Richard White actually, the like I said, uncovers the existence of the society marked by this blending of both Algonquin and French. And again, the conditions of possibility for this state of affairs in the first place is probably due to the fact that they were more humane and liberal in the way they looked at each other, okay, across the board. All right, so as Richard White mentions, and as stated there in the slide, the middle ground was marked by a collapse of boundaries. You see coexistence happening rather than conflict. It was based on the willingness to accommodate each other, the willingness to look at each other in terms of relative equality, rather than imposing, as I described earlier, this lens of civilization, which made the civilized, or made them believe, the civilized that is, that they were inherently superior to the savage. Okay. So, again, this is interesting. It lasted for quite a while, actually. Okay, quite a few decades. So, ever since Richard White's book was published, his discovery of the middle ground, what it did is disrupted a lot of preconceived ideas about the old world confronting the new world. Earlier, historians tend to look at this, and even the common person, right? If you think about this without any sort of specialized academic training, if you just have a sort of cursory understanding of what happened in this confrontation, you many of you may think of, oh yeah, this conquest was bound to happen. It's inevitable. You have superior military. You have the cannons and the gunpowder and the muskets and the beginning of a modern army and all this stuff. The Indians could not match that, right? Well, if you think along those lines, which has, of course, high degree of truth, you tended to think of conquest in a linear fashion, meaning that it was bound to happen, and there's no way this would be disrupted. Okay, that this conquest was meant to happen. It was inevitable for certain reasons, and it followed a linear trajectory in terms of its historical path, right? Till it ends, at least in American history, with Indians forced to be um, forced upon reservations, right, by the late 1800s, and that ends the confrontation of civilization and savagery, supposedly. Okay, so what Richard White's theory does, it's not a theory actually, it's actuality. It was a state of affairs here, an actual state of affairs. What this does is disrupt or dislodge, disproves this idea of linear conquest. Things could have been different. Okay, it could have been a case from the very beginning. Let's imagine again in a thought experiment. What if Columbus and Cortez and Montezuma, who was the king of the Aztec Empire, or Pizarro, who conquered the Inca Empire? What if all these guys involved in the very beginning stages of the old world meets the new world? What if they were willing to accommodate each other? What if they entertained the idea of coexistence? What if old world Europeans did not bring over civilization? This idea that, those who don't conform to civilization are therefore savage, right? You're defining them again by not who they are, but what they are not. They are not settled. They are not following the proper gender roles. They're not. They don't have laws. Therefore, they are savages, right? Okay. What if that didn't happen? What if things happen in the way, rather, that the middle ground happen where you have a collapse of boundaries. Okay, the whole point is this: that things may have been drastically different. Okay, just like I imagine you to imagine, what if the old world residents had no resistance to new world diseases when they first came over, right? Rather than the other way around. Well, as I mentioned, the United States of America would probably never even exist the way we know it today, right? You could argue the same thing with the middle ground, okay? That the middle ground, if it was based on mutual accommodation, who knows what could have happened, right? But it just so happened that, this it was a story of conflict because of certain reasons, like, this idea that Christianity had to be spread, or that wealth had to be attained, or that conquest had to had to occur, and so forth, right? Okay, so again, to harken back to an early concept here, one that's recurring in this class, really, this whole course, is contingency. Okay, what Richard White's thesis on the middle ground does, okay, is disrupt the linear conquest thesis as well as highlighting the contingency of the old world confronting the new world. It could have been otherwise, right? It could have been something different, you know. So this idea of linear conquest again is destabilized, if you will, by Richard White's middle ground. Okay, that it was actually not a linear event. It was marked by combination rather than inevitable conquest. Okay, so hopefully you could see the relationship there between contingency, that is to say, something that could have happened, right? Of course, let's make a step backwards, saying this: yes, it is true that conquest happened. However, it's not a necessary truth. That is to say, it had to happen, and there was no way around it, right? But it's actually a contingent truth. That is again, it could have happened otherwise, and Richard White's middle ground shows us that yes, it could have happened. Okay, it constitute veritable. It constitutes, excuse me, veritable proof that it could have happened. Okay, so hopefully that's clear to you guys. Okay, so now we're going to focus a little bit on the Dutch. Okay, and like I keep mentioning, they played a more minor role in colonization, but they had their presence. In fact, if you go to New York State today or New Jersey, you're going to see the legacy of early Dutch colonization in some of the names of the small towns, some of the boroughs in New York. They're Dutch names. Okay, that's because the Dutch tended to concentrate or focus upon what we call today New York and New Jersey and Delaware, and those colonies would be eventually sold to England by the 1720s, 1730s. Okay, so they're going to be later colonies after Massachusetts, after Pennsylvania, after Maryland, and so forth, the Carolinas. Okay, but when the Dutch came, they're like the French. They want to focus on wealth, the attainment of wealth. Okay, in fact, there was a very important institution called the Dutch West Indies Company. All right, and this company, notice the word Indies, right? Because they're concerned with trying to reach India, right? But this is the West Indies, not the East Indies, right? So, it's basically this company, as it says in its last word of this, it's a company. Okay, what does this mean? Another term for this company during this time of early colonialism is chartered company. And here's what's happening. This should sound familiar to anyone today who knows what a corporation is. Basically, you have investors putting their money together, private investors, okay, for the most part, not public as in state or government, but private investors funding or putting their money together in order to subsidize a particular commercial enterprise. And the whole goal of this, investment is to hopefully make profit. Okay, so that's what the Dutch Indies Company is an attempt to get profit for its investors as well as the explorers themselves and the traders. Okay, now there's a famous story, and some of you may have heard of this, of how the Dutch purchased Manhattan Island. Okay, present day Manhattan Island in New York City. All right, today it's worth, who knows how many billions in real estate, right? Okay, so back then when the Dutch, was trading in this area, of course they noticed Manhattan Island. It was occupied by some natives there. So they really wanted to gain it as a Dutch territory. Okay, so they came up with this idea, and this is a true story. It's not folklore. Okay, some people think this is just folklore, but it's actually true. All right, the Dutch decided to try to trick the Indians. What are they going to do? They brought over this chest, these treasure chests, as you see there in the depiction, in the illustration, and they filled it with a bunch of cheap items, right? Made of glass, cheap trinkets, cheap baubles, no gold, no silver, or valuable metals. They were very shiny, okay? But that's what they were hoping to do, to trick the Indians into what? Trading the land of Manhattan for these trinkets. Okay, so they actually endeavored in this, and they succeeded. That is to say, the Indians agreed to accept those trinkets and cheap baubles and cheap items, and in return they decided to resettle somewhere else, probably just across the way, right across the river, settled across the way, right? All right, so here's the famous story of the Dutch purchase of Manhattan Island. It was seen as a ripoff, right? They ripped them off, the Indians, that is, right? The Dutch, laughed all the way to the bank, to use another modern day expression. Okay. And moreover, it's usually indicated as a sign of so-called Indian irrationality. What does this mean? It means that the tribes there could not understand this concept of value, right? They got bamboozled. They got tricked because they can't grasp it, right? It's outside their worldview. They don't know anything in terms of worth or value, right? Putting a price on something, right? They also thought things like, you can't really own land. So this brings up another important point that you may be aware of. Indians did not conceive of anything in terms of land ownership or private property, okay, as we do today in a modern sense, like real estate, right? This is my property, get off my property, things like that, right? So the way they're thinking is we take these trinkets and we just move across, because after all, they just want to hang out here in this island, right? They're not thinking about ownership, right? Okay, so again, this story is told repeatedly as an instance of Indian irrationality. But here's a way to rethink it. And what we have here is a collision of worldviews again, right? Old world meets the new world. Now, modern day anthropologists in, I would say, the late 20th century, and even today in the 21st century, who have looked into the way indigenous people, pre-modern people, right, non-Western people, like, let's say, Amazonian tribes or sub-Saharan tribes in Africa or what have you, and they try to look into the ways they look at value, okay, especially if it's pre-modern. That is to say, they have no contact with things like the market, or no knowledge of things like the market, let alone capitalism, right? And these anthropologists have discovered this, that value was really placed In their thought world, in their worldview, value was really placed, the highest value, I should say, was placed on things or items that had ceremonial or religious significance. They had this ceremonial function, right? This is what resonated with them in terms of what's valuable. Okay. So, on the other hand, the Dutch are confronting with these same Indians who have a different view of value. What's their view of value? Right? It's based on the market, just like we see things today on the market. Oh, we see this Apple laptop. We could figure that it's worth about, almost 2 grand, right? We have the sense of value based on the market, right? So going back all the way here in the 1500s, the Dutch are aware that what they have in that chest, as I mentioned, is cheap. There's virtually no value, right, in it. So here's what's happening, and here's a way to rethink the purchase of Manhattan Island. That with the Indian emphasis on the highest value being placed on items that are ceremonial, what the Indians are doing is occupying this thought world, or thinking from that thought world, um, whereby you could call it this ceremonial space. Okay, this ceremonial space is what's dictating this trade. All right. The Dutch are occupying what you could call this market thought world, or the market space. They're involved in a way of looking at value that's drastically different from the Indians. So, from the Indians' perspective, you could actually argue that they felt they were ripping off the Dutch. Why? Because those various things that were shiny and bright and attractive, right, all meant something in a religious sense. The land, on the other hand, from the Indians' point of view, anyone could stay on it. What's the big deal? You can't own land like you can't own the air or own animals, right? That's the way they're thinking. The natural landscape. You can't really own that, and that goes for land too. But land ownership becomes really important in early capitalism, right? Even different from land ownership as it was conceived in feudal medieval Europe, and we'll talk about that later. Okay, so that's a different way to think about it. How you could think about it is different ways or divergent interpretations of value. Again, the Dutch are looking at it through the lens of the market, and their value is determined by that. On the other hand, Indians are looking at it through uh, um, a purely religious way. Okay, their thought world is basically dictated by religion. Okay, now if you think that, well, no matter how you put it, right? How could you say that the Indians didn't get ripped off? Well, you could say that certainly from the Dutch point of view. Of course, it's true. But put it this way: if you think religion or religious belief it's ridiculous to place highest value on that. Okay, you're underestimating the degree to which people who are very religious put value on religion. In fact, many people are willing to put their lives at stake in, based on their religion. We know that with, say, suicide bombers of these radical Muslims, right? Or I could even think in the case of my mother, okay, to put a personal story here, and let's imagine that she goes to the Vatican. She's a very devout Catholic. She gets holy water that's blessed by the Pope himself, right? This, as a devout Christian, a devout Catholic, is the most important and valuable thing she has. Is she going to put a price tag on it, or does it escape a price tag? Is she going to sell this on eBay? And if so, how is she going to put a price on this water blessed by the Pope, right? You can't really, if you're religious, you think it escapes the market, right? You're occupying what I call the ceremonial space, your ceremonial thought world, okay, not the market thought world. Okay, in fact, there's slogans even today with credit cards. What's priceless, right? When you use your credit card, right? There's certain things that are priceless that you can't put a price on, right? And this applies certainly to this transaction. All right. Okay, so we're going to have one last slide for this topic.